Hey everyone, Chris here with another filler video, and this time I want to tackle the topic of VR, because I've been playing VR games since the middle of 2020, and I have a lot to say on the subject. To that end, I'm going to break this video down into three main sections. The first section will be about getting into VR in the first place, including figuring out ahead of time if VR is something you really want to burn money on, and what your options are. The second section is about how to actually enjoy VR on a regular basis, as a common sentiment is people will try out VR and get bored with it relatively quickly, and then never touch it again. And there's some interesting reasons why this happens, which I will demonstrate. And the last section of the video, we'll be talking about the games I enjoy most across various genres, and showcasing them for a little bit while explaining exactly what it is which makes them enjoyable. And I guarantee, some of my choices may come as a surprise, because you're not going to see any mega popular games in there like Super Hot, Beat Saber, Half-Life Alyx. I mean, those are all good games. They certainly didn't get popular by being bad. But it'll make more sense why I don't outright recommend them or play them myself as we get further into this. And yeah, apologies for the shaky cam, but that's just how it is recording VR gameplay. I did my best to keep my head as still as possible and to make my motions as smooth as possible, but quite frankly, it's not easy. Just remember that when you're actually playing in VR, this shaking thing is not a factor in the slightest. What you're witnessing are the subtle motions our heads make all the freaking time, which our eyes automatically compensate for. Thus, when you're wearing a VR headset, which is picking up and adjusting for all of those subtle motions, things just look totally smooth to you, but totally shaky to anyone else watching. Firstly, let's say you haven't had any experience with VR yet, but the idea sounds intriguing. Well, before anything else, see if there's an amusement center in your area which has a VR setup, because checking out a professional VR setup ahead of time may give you an idea of if you want to spend money on a home VR setup. Which, to be fair, all that basically means is being able to clear out a minimum of a 6x6 foot square wherever you want to play, as it's important when playing a VR game to have plenty of space around you to move your arms while sitting, or to move your whole body while standing, depending on what works best for you with the game you intend to play. Secondly, before you spend a dime on any kind of VR equipment, ask yourself a very simple question. What do you want out of VR? I know this seems like a dumb question, but if you go into VR not knowing what you want to get out of it, I guarantee you will consider the investment a waste of money in the long run. What I wanted out of VR was to be able to interact with and explore game worlds in a more tangible way, to feel like I was in those worlds and able to escape reality. These ideals are what guided my VR game purchases in the long run, once I understood this concept, since I originally got into VR more so because of the novelty concept and because I wanted to try making VR games. In any case, once you know what it is that you want out of VR, you should next look at what your game options are on the various VR platforms, of which there are presently 3 with any real depth to their catalogs: PC, PlayStation, and MetaQuest. Yeah, if your PC is not a gaming rig and the only game consoles you have are a Switch or Xbox, then your only decent VR option at the moment is going to be a MetaQuest headset, since those are entirely autonomous and linked to their own storefront for purchasing apps and games. Though I should add, the soon-to-be-released Steam Frame will also be fully autonomous and will allow playing literally all PC games in VR without having to actually own a PC. Though naturally, any game not designed for VR is just going to play like you're looking at a giant screen in a virtual space. However, if you do have a PlayStation, now the PlayStation library becomes a possible avenue for playing VR-capable titles, as you might be surprised by just how many PlayStation games have VR support. Basically, here's a simple chart to show you what gaming storefronts you'll have access to with which popular headset brands. Again, remembering that the upcoming Steam Frame from Valve does not require owning a PC, though if you have a decent gaming PC, you can certainly tether to it. Also, be aware that the original PSVR headset is generally not PC compatible. You need a PSVR 2 headset to use it with a PC. So let's say you pull the trigger and finally purchase a VR headset. Your very first time putting one on will probably feel surreal, up until you push on an analog stick to move or turn your position, and suddenly realize you feel very weird. Yeah, that's vertigo, and it's being caused by the fact that your brain is reacting to the movement around you as if you were really moving, which in turn causes your body to react to the movement, which feels very wrong because you're not actually moving. To that end, when you're brand new to VR, you'll likely want to stick with what's referred to as teleport controls, whereby instead of walking around a game world using the analog stick as you would in a non-VR game, you point at the spots you want to move to and you teleport into those spots. Now, unfortunately, not all VR titles support teleport controls, and even when a game does, it doesn't necessarily play well in that manner, especially action-centric games. However, you have additional options if you want to try and train your brain to be comfortable with smooth VR movement. Now, even though not all VR games support teleport controls, many offer a feature called a vignette, whereby whenever you're using the analog stick to move, contrary to your physical position in real life, a static haze is placed over your peripheral vision to make it look as though you're viewing the world through a periscope. By doing this, your brain now has something in a fixed position to latch onto, and thus the movement you witness doesn't trick your brain into reacting like your whole body is moving. Now, some games also offer more creative options for movement, such as watching an out-of-body avatar move, or having the world phase around you while you teleport. Now, those options can help ease you into smooth motion over time, and really, anyone playing VR can adapt to full smooth motion over time. It's just the amount of time it takes varies wildly. For myself, it took me 3 years before I could use smooth motion 100% of the time. Yet for someone else I know, who shall remain anonymous, it took them 2 days. Really, there's no way to know how long it will take for each individual. And because of that, it means when you first get into VR, be prepared to be a little frustrated by not being able to really play the games you want to play because of having to adapt to this particular facet of VR gaming. Another thing you'll be asked to do when you first put on a headset is to designate your valid play space. Meta calls this feature the Guardian, Steam calls it the Chaperone, and modern PSVR calls it Boundaries, though early PSVR didn't actually have this feature. The idea is that by setting up the bounds of your play space, the system can overlay those bounds in your headset when you get too close to them to let you know that you're nearing the limits of what you set as your safe area to play in. Now, I will admit, the very first day I was playing with my brand new Oculus Rift S headset, despite having the Guardian set up and everything, I managed to smash my right knuckles into my closet door. I even scraped a tiny portion of texturing off of the plastic for the right-hand controller. The lesson I learned from that is to always define your play area to be slightly smaller than your actual play area by about 2 or 3 inches. That way, if you do exceed your boundaries, you're not going to immediately smash your expensive VR equipment into anything, and will just be less likely to injure yourself in general. Lastly, before we move on to the next section of the video, one really important thing to remember when playing in VR is to stay hydrated. Have some water or something nearby, preferably with a straw in it, so that you can use your headset's pass-through camera to locate it, take a few sips, and get right back into your game. And of course, make sure you leave it well outside of your play space. So let's say you bought a VR headset quite some time ago, had your fun with it, but haven't touched it in years, or decided to give it away or sell it to someone else. Now, a lot of people get the impression VR is dead or dying because this happens so frequently, and it's a threefold reason why this happens. 1, people not getting what they really want out of VR. 2, paying premium prices for games which provide a fraction of the gameplay found in non-VR games. And 3, only getting experiences you could get just as easily from a non-VR game. And quite frankly, the early days of VR were flooded with games which were either too expensive for how extremely little gameplay they provided, or didn't offer gameplay compelling enough to want to go through the effort of putting a headset on. And it's not like those games have disappeared. If you're not careful, you will very much end up buying such a game and regretting the purchase. Let me give you an example. One of the first games I purchased for my headset way back when I got it was Star Wars Vader Immortal Episode 1. I mean, sure, episodic content, that should have been my first warning, but it was only $12 Canadian, so I figured, hey, might as well give it a shot. I don't have to buy the other 2 episodes unless I like it. So here's how Vader Immortal Episode 1 plays out. You're on a ship, you mess with some switches and dials but end up getting captured. Darth Vader tests your intelligence with a weird doodad. You break out of captivity, climb a bunch of stuff, find the lightsaber, watch Vader have a bit of a breakdown, defend against some stormtroopers shooting at you, cut apart a few too many robots, have Vader entice you to the dark side, roll credits. The entire game, from beginning to end, lasts a mere 37 minutes. I mean, if this was a cheap indie title going for artistic merit, then sure, you might be able to get away with having it that short. But this is freaking Star Wars. You spend the first half of this experience hardly doing anything, only have 2 big fights in the second half, and to add insult to injury, the lightsaber is actually an example of having quote-unquote motion controls in a VR game. Yeah, you heard me right. I am accusing a VR game of having motion controls. Here's the thing. When a VR game is done well, how you move your hands and how you wield an object shouldn't matter. The idea is, let the motion of your hands naturally affect the world around you. Here in Vader Immortal, to deflect a blaster shot back towards an attacker, you literally have to perform a forward pushing motion with the lightsaber. It's incredibly unnatural feeling, and only seems to register correctly half the time. Deflecting a blaster shot back shouldn't have been anything more than just hitting the blaster shot with the lightsaber, but no, they had to go and overcomplicate it. And yeah, I know, the game has a sort of training mode so you can get a bigger lightsaber wielding fix, but that still doesn't negate how dumb the deflection mechanics are. There's other examples which I don't own, but the point is, a very large chunk of the games made for VR, which sound fun and exciting, are ultimately letdowns for one reason or another. I mean, one kind of VR game I really want to have is a racing game, which lets me use my Oculus Touch controllers, either like independent thruster controls for futuristic racing, something like how pod racing in the Star Wars universe works, or turning my hands around like a steering wheel for contemporary racing. But take a guess, how many VR-compatible racing games I've come across actually have controls like that? 5, 6, 3, no, freaking none! Every single racing game with VR support, to the best of my knowledge, requires you to use an actual steering wheel accessory, a mouse and keyboard, or a gamepad. And every single comment I've seen from developers about not supporting tracked controllers comes from a place of ignorance instead of understanding. The thing is, a big part of what makes a VR experience fun are the motions you perform with your hands and arms. The moment a VR game has me reaching for a traditional controller, it's lost me, because now I can get that same experience without having to put the headset on. Various other kinds of complaints have sprung up over the years as well. To give a couple more examples, a lot of early VR shooters relied on the concept of your head being the target. Thus, to dodge attacks, all you do is just move your head. This can be strange because when something in VR passes through the space occupied by the core of your physical body, it can often feel very off-putting. Yet, these shooter games effectively required this kind of thing to happen, since as far as the game logic was concerned, you were just a floating head, nothing more. Another thing which plagued early VR titles more so than later titles is that they were simply third-person adaptations of existing games. As in, you were still just playing the original game, but were now floating in space, watching the gameplay as a third-person observer. Which again defeats the purpose of being in VR in the first place. Lastly, if you look at the modern VR landscape, you're going to see that not a lot of AAA developers are there anymore. And many of them gave up and moved on because VR didn't become the goldmine they were hoping for. But, I mean, really, what were they expecting? About only 1 out of every 100 gamers own a VR headset, and that's just a rough estimate. This means a lot of the best titles are indie titles, or are from smaller studios and publishers. What this also means is having to adapt to graphics, which are probably going to be lower fidelity or have less variety than you might be used to, and having to adapt to a bit of jank and the occasional weird bug. But in return, you are far more likely to find games which are worth playing for more than just an hour or two. But I do want to stress, that's just the general state of things. You absolutely can find proper VR titles from AAA developers. Or what's more likely are titles which are designed both ways, to primarily run without VR, but have some level of support for VR, either built in or as a separate purchase. So what does this all mean about truly enjoying VR? Well, it means you have to be willing to go above and beyond what people are feeding you to find the stuff that you really want to play. Plus, it means taking a lot of gambles, as the games which are the most fun in VR often don't have the most compelling graphics or mechanics, but what makes them fun to play is how you play them, along with how much gameplay you can get out of them. Effectively, what you end up enjoying most in VR will almost certainly not match up with what you enjoy playing most outside of VR. For instance, two games I have for VR are Pierhead Arcade and Pierhead Arcade 2, which are both essentially amusement center simulators. I also happen to have The Coin Game. Same kind of game as Pierhead Arcade, but with no VR support, at least as of my making this video. As far as content is concerned, The Coin Game effortlessly beats both Pierhead Arcade games combined. But I prefer Pierhead Arcade because the experience of playing all of these amusement center games appeals more to me in VR than outside of VR, because of the kinds of motions I am performing to play them in VR. Unfortunately, figuring out this dichotomy is not easy, and because so many VR games just aren't up to the task of providing a rich, fulfilling experience, it's too easy to get burned too many times, just give up searching. Even now, there's one kind of game in particular I really want to play in VR, but it just flat out doesn't exist. In fact, it doesn't exist as a non-VR game either. And that's what my own Project AB is aiming to become. Yeah, what you're seeing now, this is the game I've been working on in my spare time for the past couple years, which, yeah, it's, as you can probably make out, it's nowhere close to done. But you can also see I've been making it work both as a standard non-VR application and giving it full, proper motion-tracked VR capabilities. I can move my hands around, make gestures, aim and utilize tools. Heck, I can throw the tools out of my hands if I'm so inclined. I have teleport controls working in a much better way than every tutorial on the face of the internet would have you do it. I've got the vignette feature working too for smooth motion. But then here's the compelling part: the side gloves. Now, outside of VR, the side gloves aren't really anything too special. You just pull things towards you, grab them in your hands or hover them in front of you, and can then drop them or push them away with the power of your mind. But using the side gloves in VR is a visceral experience and just plain feels good. This aspect alone is helping to prove to me that my game is on the right track. And I still haven't even revealed the core theme yet. So yeah, I'm fortunate enough to have enough game dev experience under my belt to be making something like this in the first place, to fill a niche that's very empty at the moment. But not everyone has that capacity. In fact, most people don't. So this leads us into the final part of this video. Firstly, before we get to my proper recommendations, there's a particular VR game I want to quickly mention, which is an extremely conditional recommendation: Blade and Sorcery. It's a hack and slash game with spellcasting mechanics and is one of the more popular VR titles, which I do own a copy of and have spent some time playing. But not a lot of time. And no, the footage right now is not from that game. The thing is, it was one of the first VR games I purchased, and so I was still sort of finding my footing in terms of getting used to how VR works. But when it actually came time to do battle, and most of my opponents were just humans wearing varying degrees of armor, it felt very weird cutting them down, like I was doing something I shouldn't be doing. And even after a couple hours of play, that feeling never went away, so I decided not to play it again. The ultimate realization was that the act of killing in VR may feel extraordinarily odd when what you're faced with strongly resembles real people or animals. So that's absolutely something to keep in mind when selecting VR games to play. Actually, a really good first game to try out would be The Lab from Valve. It's essentially a cheapest free compilation of various tech demos and games Valve made while they were creating their own VR hardware, packaged together into a hub world run by Aperture Science. It is effectively one of the best ways to get a taste of the various kinds of VR interactions possible, and has more content and stuff to do than some paid games. There's also tons of hidden secrets and Easter eggs in this thing, especially when you take advantage of a little VR trick I like to call inversion walking. The lab has fixed borders set up in terms of where the player is allowed to go, but this only affects the anchor point of where the world is positioned relative to your play space. So, what you can do to escape these boundaries is to start at one end of your play space, walk forward in real life to the other end of your play space, then rotate the camera in the world 180 degrees and walk backwards back to where you started and repeat this process. This trick effectively allows you to physically move yourself in a VR world beyond where the game normally permits you to go. And while some VR games have checks and barriers in place to prevent this kind of movement, the lab is not one of them, and thus there's quite a number of neat things to find here when you take advantage of this trick. Or heck, if you do this in Rúðufossur, the Icelandic lava tube, you'll be able to pick up a mysterious golden-plated device. It rapidly fills the cave with balloons. Now moving on, I had already mentioned Pierhead Arcade and Pierhead Arcade 2, and yes, I absolutely recommend these games because they basically provide the experience of playing ticket-earning games at an amusement center, but without having to spend a mountain of real money. The first Pierhead Arcade focuses more so on physical games than games of chance, while Pierhead Arcade 2 focuses a little more on the chance-based games, but still has a good mix of the two. The sheer variety of physical motions required to play all of these amusement center games is a big part of what makes Pierhead Arcade fun. Plus, you can spend the tickets you earn on various toys, which serve no purpose other than just be fun little distractions. Again, adding additional physical motions to the mix. The only drawback I would say is that you really need to have a large play space to get the most out of this, as a handful of the games on offer do not work well if you're stuck with only the minimum amount of space possible. A fun little aside too, one of my favorite games in the first Pierhead Arcade is this shuffleboard type game with little penguin pucks, and while recording the footage for making this video, I managed to beat my record score. For the most part though, because I was just playing to capture footage, most of my scores ended up being not so great. Oh well. If you'd like a game that's a bit more whimsical, I would recommend Fujii, a self-proclaimed gardening adventure. As indeed, the core of the game centers around exploring worlds with unusual kinds of plants and bringing life back to these worlds through your ability to absorb and spray water. The narrative of the game is actually pretty short, but it is a visual treat for sure, and includes the ability to create your own gardens within the hub world using seeds found during your explorations. This game is definitely more so for anyone who wants something surreal to explore and isn't looking for a physically demanding experience. Now, if you would rather play something physically demanding, the most intense VR game I own, and the one that reminds me just how weak and frail I really am, is simply titled Until You Fall. This is a hack and slash game like no other, since it relies heavily on counterattack mechanics, as in, you block your opponent's attacks to create an opening in their defenses, then strike precisely as indicated to deal maximum damage, with the force of your swings also factoring into the damage dealt, as in, the harder you swing, the more damage you deal. I'd really like to be able to play this game more, but quite frankly, I just have to play for 20 minutes and my legs will feel like jello, since you not only strike and block, but you also have to dodge some attacks by physically ducking under them or swaying off to the left or right. Part of what makes this game work at all, though, is the lack of shields. You are dual wielding every step of the way. This doesn't work out so well really, because sure, dual wielding sounds fun until you actually try it and realize it ain't easy. So what I do instead is I set up my right hand weapon to be my main attack weapon, while I set up my left hand weapon to be something which adds to my defenses or provides bonuses or special abilities which help me out the most, without ever really attacking with it. The reason I recommend this game over something similar like Beat Saber is because Beat Saber is technically a rhythm game, so what matters most there is staying on rhythm and enjoying the variety of songs on offer. Whereas here in Until You Fall, the variety is in the opponents, the actions you perform, the weapons, and the many ways you can power yourself up as you make progress. Again, it all comes down to what you want out of VR, and for me, I prefer gameplay variety over content variety. Speaking of variety, that's kind of the reason I don't have Half-Life Alyx in my recommendations, is that even though it's a freaking amazing game, there's not actually a lot of variety to its gameplay elements, not to mention it's priced the same as any other AAA title. Instead, my recommendation if you want a shooter is Compound. When you first play Compound, it's not going to seem like anything too special, just a retro-styled shooter with randomly generated levels, but as you get deeper in, more weapons are unlocked, and the variety of weapons on offer is what really makes this game stand out, especially given that the weapons you get access to on each run are going to be completely different, effectively forcing you to learn how to make the most out of each of them. It's also a shooter which doesn't play that badly with teleport controls. Though to be frank, playing shooters with teleport controls really just doesn't work out all that well. What I'm trying to say though is that if you want an experience shooting stuff in VR, Compound is a really fun starting point. But then, what if you want something so incredibly chill you can just sit down and veg out? Well, in that case, I would recommend Cubism. It's a game I've mentioned once before, and is essentially just a simple game of fitting smaller shapes into bigger shapes, but in 3 dimensions. Similar to the older 2D titles like Daily and Opus. Since I initially purchased this game, it's also had an editor built right into it, allowing you to craft your own puzzles simply by first defining the shape to fill, and then defining the pieces within the shape. And granted, it can be a little silly crafting a puzzle yourself, knowing the solution, and then trying to solve it, but one thing you can always try is to solve it after the fact by placing the pieces in the wrong spots. Regardless, there's plenty of built-in puzzles to keep you going, all set to some piano music, which preemptively fades out when the game realizes you're about to solve a puzzle, which is actually pretty clever, all things considered. Unfortunately, not all games meant to be chill games work while sitting down. One such game I have is called Color Space, and it's essentially a VR coloring book where you have a palette and a color lasers, and you use the laser to assign colors to various parts of the world around you, bringing some things to life once color is applied. The thing is though, this is an example of a VR game which doesn't reset the head position based on where it is vertically, instead relying exclusively on the vertical tracking data provided by the headset. This means if you sit down in this game, you also end up sitting down in the world itself, and this can make it difficult to do things. I mean, you can always sit down on a chair instead of straight on the floor, but still, I don't like it when VR games, which would otherwise play just fine seated, don't allow me to reset my head tracking position vertically. However, this brings us on to one of my big game recommendations, Ancient Dungeon VR. This is effectively a hack and slash dungeon crawl with a massive number of different kinds of items to collect to power yourself up, various weapons and upgrades, multiplayer, New Game Plus, and a whole host of features. This is one of my favorite VR titles because not only is it only moderately physical, requiring you to slash with a sword, throw daggers, or manipulate other weapons, but it's perfectly playable seated, with options to manually adjust your seating height so that you can still feel like you're standing appropriately. That's actually something I should mention by this point, is that it's a lot easier to get used to smooth motion when you're sitting down as opposed to standing up. So games like this one, which allow vertical height adjustment by default, are a great way to train your brain for smooth motion. Granted, this game does have teleport controls, but quite frankly, the action is far too hectic for them to work well. Another game which is perfectly playable in VR while seated is, believe it or not, No Man's Sky. Yeah, I know, No Man's Sky was kind of a joke when it came out because it barely delivered on any of the features it was promising, but if you haven't touched it since release, you might be surprised by the sheer quantity of features and content added directly into the main game for free ever since, with one of those features being full, proper, motion-tracked VR support. Once they put VR into this game, it ended up becoming the only way I wanted to play it, because they didn't just shoehorn it in, they actually put some thought into how to make it all work right, both with smooth motion and teleport controls. And one of the great things too is that the game adjusts vertical tracking appropriately when you reset your position, and offers a very simple shortcut to do a reset in just 2 seconds. Thus, one thing I like to do when playing is stand up in my play space when I'm out on foot, but once I climb into a spaceship, I sit down and reset my tracking position so I can be seated in the spaceship. Then, when I get out, I stand up and once again do a tracking reset to play standing. Basically, if you want to get some VR space exploration going, this is hands down one of the best ways to do it. Speaking of the best ways to do something, this next game is one which I kind of feel actually surpasses the real activity it's emulating, titled Walkabout Mini Golf. When this game first came out, it had a fair number of 18-hole courses, along with exploration and hidden object mechanics to unlock different kinds of balls and putters. Plus, each course had both a standard mode and a hard mode, which alters each hole to be more difficult. Since that initial release, the number of courses has skyrocketed, some of which are free to play, others of which are paid DLC. And yeah, to experience all of the courses in this game effectively requires spending a huge amount of cash, $5 per additional course. And yeah, that adds up fast, but then if mini golf is something you really enjoy, then you could certainly spend your money worse. But I mentioned this game surpasses the real activity of playing mini golf. One of the things you typically have to do when you go to play real miniature golf is select a putter, and that means finding one that's sized exactly as you need it to be. Walkabout Mini Golf does something truly unique by automatically adjusting the size of the putter as you play so that you always strike the ball appropriately. This one mechanic alone makes it so much easier to play the game, but there's also options to tweak the strength of your putting so that it can feel more natural to your own motions, plus the putter won't actually make contact with the ball unless you're holding a button down, thus allowing you to practice all you need and not worry about hitting the ball until you're ready to actually do it. About the only negative thing I have to say about this game is that the level of difficulty is relatively high overall, so if you get easily frustrated, you may not actually enjoy this game all that much. However, sometimes the draw of VR is being able to do things you simply can't do in reality, or being able to do things which in a non-VR game would otherwise be boring. This brings us onto one of my favorite VR titles, Master Bladesmith. Now, I want to say straight up before I go more in-depth into this one that it's an abandoned game. There's a number of weird bugs which were never fixed, and a number of features which were never implemented, such as elemental effects and boss fights. But the reason why this game is a favorite of mine is because it's a perfect blend of physical and non-physical VR gameplay, whereby the main goal is to fight your way through 1,000 waves of targets and arrows being flung at you, by crafting your own weapons by hand. Seriously, when I first became aware of motion-tracked VR headsets as we know them today, before I had even considered buying one, I felt that the one kind of game I would most want would be one where I could forge my own swords. Well, that's what you do in this game. There's nearly 24 different kinds of swords you can forge in this game, with the process being relatively similar between them all, but often with subtle differences. For instance, I wanted to make a new knight sword here, which the book tells me requires a blade made of a large ingot of copper, nickel, or invar, a handle made from a large tin ingot, a pommel made from a small tin ingot, and a hilt made of a large tin ingot. But some swords have wooden parts that you need to spin on the lathe, which you instead mostly use for preparing arrow shafts. Because yes, you even have to make your own bows and your own arrows, though the game thankfully takes some mercy on you and gives you a few dozen arrows per single crafting of them. Back to making the sword though. The first task is to melt down the ores needed using the forge and the crucible. Most hardware on the swords in this game are made of tin, and a knight sword in particular needs 1 small tin ingot and 2 large, which is a total of 7 units of raw tin ore. To make an invar blade though requires a 1-to-1 mix of nickel and iron, and since there's no reason to ever make small ingots of invar, other than to maybe sell for money, I toss in 3 of each to mix up 2 large invar ingots. Once I have my ingots prepared, I need to place them on the bed of the forge to heat them up. Then, once they're glowing hot, I can take them over to the anvil and work them with the hammer. Now, I should point out that even though I'm only making a single sword right now, this aspect of the game is more simplified than it may seem, and you can effectively hammer together multiple ingots into the same hardware pieces all at the same time if you're intending to make multiple swords. When it comes time to make the blade though, this is where things could go horribly wrong, and at the end of the process the blade could end up shattering, wasting the ingot and all the work that went into it. But so long as your smithing skill is high enough for the kind of blade you're making, and you make an effort to forge the blade smartly, with a hot but not too hot ingot, and hammering the parts which need the most flattening, it should turn out at least acceptable, as each blade can have one of 5 levels of quality: poor, average, good, great, and pristine, which in turn directly affects the overall quality of the sword when you assemble it, though you can only get a pristine sword with a pristine blade. Beyond forging swords though, you also have a mining machine to monitor, upgrade, and fuel in order to generate the ores you need, plus there's a self-service shop you can visit for purchasing various things like potions, wood, and armor, though you can also flat out buy swords from the shop if you're so inclined, though most of the time you're better off forging one yourself. The deeper you get into the game, the more kinds of potions and armor which become available, plus better wood becomes available for crafting bows and arrows, since the deeper you get into the game, stronger targets start showing up in the archery rounds, requiring 2 or more shots to break if you don't keep your bow and arrows upgraded appropriately. Now I will admit, despite all of these features, the raw game part of the game, cutting down and shooting targets in the time chamber, is incredibly repetitive, and sometimes a little unfair, seeing as there's no real patterns to any of it. Everything just gets flung at you entirely at random. Plus there's only a single generic music track to accompany the action. I would say if you plan to play this game for any length of time, you may want to keep your own music playlist on standby and disable the game's music. But yeah, the entire reason why I recommend this game over similar titles like Beat Saber is because there's a bigger variety to the kinds of stuff you're doing, and because it has a stronger emphasis on skill over memorization. Plus, you get to do stuff in this game which would otherwise be much more boring if it was done without the motion tracking benefits of VR. But when all is said and done, sometimes all you want to do is relax, unwind, maybe hang out with friends or other people, or maybe just go exploring. And to that end, my final recommendation for this video is VRChat, a free piece of software which also works without a VR headset, designed specifically to allow people to effectively do just about anything they want to together in a virtual environment. Essentially, VRChat itself is just an interface built upon the Unity game engine, and then what you can do with it is limited only by what other people have created through Unity to work within the VRChat API. The main thing I myself use VRChat for is exploration. I'll go in, pull up the list of newly created worlds, see if any of them sound appealing, then launch into them and just explore. Well, sure, a large number of worlds are just asset flips and aren't really intended for other people to explore within, as many of them are just home worlds players initially launch into before deciding to go elsewhere. But there are plenty of unique and highly creative places to find as well, some of which are entirely original, some of which are based on popular franchises. I mean, I can't even begin to count the number of attempts people have made to make a 3D version of Snowdin Town from Undertale. Again though, this is all based on the Unity game engine, so you can indeed find games to play as well. One of the early popular games was a tower defense style game, where you set up various kinds of turrets and blast away different kinds of vehicles. Now, there's plenty of worlds which have driving or flight mechanics of some kind, such as this world where you're flying through the Tron Legacy Badlands in a light jet. There's a Minesweeper game with a board that's, really big, to put it mildly. And also because a number of people like to fall asleep in real life and subsequently wake up while still in VR, idle games are a popular thing to run into too. Mirrors are also kind of a big deal in VRChat, given that there's countless thousands of avatars people have created, with it being extremely rare for a VRChat player to have an avatar equipped which reflects their real life self. Most players instead will have avatars based off of their own creations, or will be cosplaying as other creatures and characters. I mean, sure, I can go around looking like I'm made of polygons, but I could also go around looking like Klonoa, or even a Dragonite, or even everyone's favorite little bundle of fluffiness. You know him, you love him, Tails Doll. Seriously, there's like 100 different Tails Doll avatars out there. Basically, what I'm trying to get at here is that VRChat is incredibly flexible as a VR experience, given that over 99% of its content is community-made, and in a strange way represents a sort of virtual zeitgeist of the creativity and desires of a sizable majority of everyone who's ever picked up a gaming controller. It is an easy recommendation for people who want to hang out and chill with friends in virtual worlds, or for people like myself who more so just want to go exploring and witness the breadth of our collective digital creativity. Anyways, time to draw this filler video to a close. I know, kind of long for a quote-unquote filler, but I wanted to help drive the point across that VR isn't dead or dying. It's just that the state it's in now is more so for the people who regularly enjoy it, and for the most part, is no longer trying to pander to or market itself as something for everyone. To that end, interest in VR really does depend on the individual, and my simplest recommendation is, unless there's something specific you want to do in VR on a regular basis, there's no point in buying a headset. But if there are things you want to experience in VR, then chances are something exists to give you that experience if you're willing to search. And if by chance it doesn't exist, the tools exist to make it yourself if you're so inclined. Make no mistake though, VR is not a goldmine. Even if you make an exceptionally good VR game, the most you should be hoping for in return is to break even, as creators making a profit from VR exclusive titles are incredibly rare. This is why my own Project AB is going to support both regular play and VR play, because I really want it to exist as a VR game, but I know that alone is a terrible idea in terms of sales potential. Yeah, it's a lot more work to make a game play properly both ways, but in the end, it'll be something I absolutely want to play in VR, while other people who don't have VR can also enjoy it. I do want to also add though that the state of VR is not being helped by certain companies trying to push VR to be things it's not and which no one wants. Meta's very terrible about this, constantly pushing the idea of a metaverse, where you do things in VR to affect reality, such as going to a virtual grocery store to buy stuff which is then sent to your real home. I mean, it's not that these ideas are bad per se, it's just no one's asking for them, and there's not really any benefit to using them. Like, all they'd be doing with that particular idea I mentioned would be adding more steps to a task people already do, which they'd rather not be doing. VR works better to experience and do things you can't normally do, or which have obstacles towards doing them in reality, or which are enhanced by adding digital features to exceed the boundaries of those tasks in reality. And yeah, there's also AR, augmented reality, but that's something I have zero experience with, so I'm not really in a good position to comment on it, even though the tech used for both VR and AR is nearly identical. So that'll be all for this filler. I really overworked myself to get this video up, along with getting set up for the next console on double energy, as well as preparing for ADG SE. So the next ADG review, episode 354, going up 2 Saturdays from now on March 28th, will be an incredibly simple game, one I actually have had a copy of since childhood. Even though I'm pretty sure if my parents saw what awaited on the final level, they would have tossed the disc into a bucket and set fire to it. So yeah, be sure to stay tuned to quote-unquote see, albeit censored, what could possibly have been so offensive in an otherwise benign and straightforward title. Thanks for watching. An extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. Just $1 a month is all it takes to help keep these shows going, so please consider joining everyone you see here over at patreon.com/KASICK.